You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis, your host for BioTalk, a podcast which we talk to leaders and entrepreneurs and scientists and researchers from around the world. And today we're very happy to have someone on the other side of the world from where we are in Rockville, Maryland today. We have Vishal Doshi, who is in Singapore, and we're recording at 9 o'clock at night for him and 8 o'clock in the morning for us. So truly international podcast that we're doing today. Vishal is the CEO of AUM Biosciences, which we're going to learn a lot about today on this podcast. And Vishal, welcome to BioTalk.
Thank you very much, Rich. Hope you're doing well.
I'm doing well, and I'm sure you're doing well as well. And we're going to let the listeners know how well AUM Biosciences is doing with the exciting company that you're growing right now and hope to take to the next level. And what we'd like to do for our listeners is, rather than me try to introduce your bio and background to everybody, we think it's best for you to do that yourself. So if you don't mind, give a little history of your own personal background and how you actually evolved to become the CEO of AUM Biosciences, Vishal.
Absolutely. So a little bit of background. I am a registered pharmacist by training. I was born and brought up in India in a bustling town in Mumbai. And when I became a registered pharmacist, I moved to London to train myself as a medicinal chemist. And I trained myself as a medicinal chemist in a pathway called the aromatase inhibitors. And my research was in breast cancer. For the listeners, they should be very familiar with the pathway aromatase inhibitors. And that's actually a standard of care right now for a lot of breast cancer therapies as well. So post which I always believed that if we need to know how to develop new science, we also need to learn how to translate that science into good commercial propositions. At the end of the day, that needs to be given to the patients in the fastest and the most economical manner as well. So I moved to the clinical side of drug development and the commercial side of drug development, where I worked with 3 of the top 5 clinical research organizations. I've been involved in approximately $4 billion worth of deal making till date, which includes joint ventures, licensing, M&A, long-term strategic partnerships. And I also work as a key opinion leader on an honorary basis with the South Korean government initiative called KHIDI as well. So I'm really excited about this conversation that we are having and looking forward to sharing some exciting things happening with AUM Biosciences.
Yeah, that is very exciting. You have mentioned something else that we have a relationship with, and we'll go into that a little further with the South Korean government. And by the way, for the listeners, it's AUM Bioscience, pronounced Biosciences. And we're going to ask Vishal, when he gets into the history here a little bit, how did you come up with the name Biosciences, Vishal?
So it has 2 components to it, right? One is the spiritual side of me coming in from India. Om is the word that you use when you do yoga. And the idea behind that is really to bring focus to the core of drug development, right? And oncology was our bread and butter throughout our experience. And we felt oncology was a great place to start off with. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is, I'm sure the listeners from the financial industry might understand AUM as assets under management. And that's very close to what we at AUM Biosciences do, because we are looking at developing a portfolio of clinical stage and preclinical stage assets, which allows us to balance our risk associated with drug development and associated with the so-called binary risk of drug development, in the sense of either it's going to be a success or a failure. But in our case, we have intentionally developed a portfolio of assets, and we do intend to do that even further to really balance the risk and minimize the potential risk associated with drug development as well. So that's how we came about with that name. It's assets under management for our financial listeners, and it's AUM for our spiritual listeners as well.
Well, that's nice that we see financial managers that have some spiritual side to them, which is unusual. But let's talk a little bit more about the beginning of the company. Where did you start it? And then when you talk about all of the assets in your pipeline and portfolio, how did you acquire the assets that you have that are under management right now?
So just to go back in the year 2018, we actually started this company in 2018. The initial thought process of setting up the company was we would need to build a portfolio of oncology drugs. And then the idea around that was looking at more preclinical stage assets, more closer to IND or phase ones rather than early preclinical assets. And our intention was really to focus on the value creation from late preclinical phase one and phase two, and especially in oncology, where we feel that it has a maximum potential for maximum value creation that we can have in late preclinical phase one and phase two. And then ultimately partner with a big pharma company or even a regional pharma company to really commercialize these drugs at a global level as well. So we started the company with a thought process that we will be building a portfolio of assets. And I'm very pleased to say we do intend to keep that focus as well. But at the same time, that was just the step one towards our growth journey. Where we are going towards the next 2 to 3 years is definitely something that we are looking at, generating some solid data from our existing portfolio, but at the same time, devise a growth strategy for the business in form of potential acquisition targets that we can think of that are complementary to our business as well.
And then did you start the company in the UK or in the Singapore area, Vishal?
I started this company in Singapore.
Okay. And how did you get to Singapore?
So I tell my wife she was the reason I moved to Singapore. So there's a personal and a professional reason. Professional because I moved to Singapore and was working with what is now Syneos Health after multiple acquisitions. And that's what got me to Singapore. But on a personal level, I met my wife in London. We moved to Singapore together and we've been married for almost 10 years now.
Well, we won't tell anybody. We'll just tell your wife that it's just all about her. And that's the reason, right?
Yeah, I think she's going to listen to this now.
No secrets here. Well, that's interesting beginnings. And basically, you had the idea of acquiring or building a portfolio of assets rather than having a single asset to work with, which a number of companies start with a single asset. So your strategy from the beginning was a portfolio strategy rather than a single asset strategy, right, Vishal?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We were very wary of the fact that when there is a one single asset company, the risk profile of that company changes quite significantly. And we have experienced that in our historical experiences around the CRO background that we bring on the table. So if I may put it that way, we used to work with the top 10, top 20 pharma companies around the world. And we have actually seen the goods and the bads across developing programs in oncology as well. So I think it's the experience that we have had prior to starting AUM Biosciences and the specific strategy that we had employed right from the very beginning. And we are still employing that strategy. If you look at our business model, we have 4 programs that, of course, we'll talk a little bit about as well. So yeah, I think that is very close to our heart as part of our overall strategy.
All right. And before we get into the portfolio and what you have in clinical stages, you mentioned being involved in over $4 billion worth of transactions or financings prior to forming Talk a little bit about that experience and how you applied that experience into what you created with them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So across various elements of financings and good relationship management with no matter if you're working from a biotech side or from a CRO side, it plays a very important role, right? And I put it this way, I am a big foodie, Rich, so I explain this in a food analogy. For you, if you want a delicious soup from a biotech standpoint, you need to have 3 good things and 3 key ingredients. Number 1 is good science. Number 2 is good team. And number 3 is what you're alluding to is good business optimization and good business decisions and deal making, right? So business optimization is very, very, very important ingredient for a successful biotech. And to that extent, throughout my career, I've always paid very close attention in building relationships, no matter if it's a small company or a large company. I've always believed in that. And as a result of which, when I was on the CRO side, there were a few strategic investment opportunities that we were involved in. There were a few long-term strategic partnerships that we were involved in, which were in hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that we were involved in as well. And at the same time, there were deal structurings that included an example of a private equity deal that we worked on. This was a $145 million private equity deal that some of the key principals within AUM Biosciences worked on. And that included identifying 6 oncology drugs in a portfolio and developing all the way until clinical proof of concept. And that was a very successful exercise that me and my co-founder and the rest, some key principals were involved in. And currently, that particular deal structure that we worked on had a 50% success rate until clinical proof of concept. And post proof of concept, they had 100% success from proof of concept to commercialization. And those drugs are currently making close to $3.5 billion for the company that we worked with as well. So for confidentiality reasons, I'm not able to disclose that, but that's actually one of the experiences that we have worked on in our history.
Well, since we work with a lot of early stage life science companies, is very fortunate to have your leadership that has both sides of the equation, understanding the science, as well as, the role of a CEO in a life science company is always constantly raising capital. So you have to be out there looking for those strategic partners. And apparently you've done a very good job at that, which we're going to learn more about. But now let's talk about your portfolio, please, Vishal. You have an interesting portfolio of oncology science at different stages in the clinical process. If you don't mind, give our listeners a little summary of your portfolio.
Absolutely, Rich. So we currently have a portfolio of 4 drugs, 2 of them in clinical, 2 of them in preclinical. AUM-001 is a selective and synergistic MNK inhibitor, as shown in the current studies. And that is currently in phase 2 of program. It's a global program that we are undertaking. Very imminent first patient in expected, with some data readouts coming out later this year as well. AUM-601 is a promising therapy for tropomyosin receptor kinase, TRK fusions and mutations within the kinase domain. And it sits on track to enter phase 2 planning as well in the near future. Now, let me cover AUM-001 first. There is 4 key differentiators that puts AUM-001 well ahead of the competition. The first point being that it's a very selective MNK inhibitor. It has approximately 99.5% selectivity to MNK1 and MNK2. We have conducted 2 phase 1 studies for that drug, and we have not seen any concerning serious adverse events to that effect. But more importantly, we have actually seen some very strong target engagement for AUM-001. The other element that makes us very optimistic about AUM-001 is the fact that we are currently working with both MSD and have signed a partnership with Roche to combine our AUM-001 with MSD's Keytruda and Roche's Tecentriq drug as well. So that's the third key element around it. And the fourth key element is for AUM-001, we are developing that drug for colorectal cancer market. We are targeting a patient population that represents approximately 80 to 85% of the entire colorectal cancer population. Significant unmet medical need is what we are targeting for. So that's for AUM-001. Happy to answer any questions that you may have, Rich, but feel free to stop me and ask me any questions in between as well. So for AUM-601, again, a very promising targeted TRK fusion and mutation inhibitor. The 4 key differentiators, as I would like to put it: number 1, it has no neurotoxicity concerns. Number 2, this is a drug that is targeting TRK fusions and mutations in a single drug. Number 3, this is not going to be a twice daily drug. It's going to be a once daily drug. And number 4 is the fact that this drug is actually accumulating in tumor more as compared to plasma. So there is a 22-fold concentration in tumor as compared to plasma and compared to the other competitive drugs which are currently on the market. So we're very excited about AUM-601 and AUM-001. OM302 is potentially a first-in-class macrocyclic oral kinase inhibitor, which is rationally designed a small molecule to uniquely combine three kinases. One is pan-PIM kinase, pan-PI3K, and mTOR inhibition in a single agent. The major differentiator that I can tell you is the fact that PI3K class of drugs have always been marred with concern around toxicity. And we have done our preliminary studies which kind of validate that the macrocyclic approach is a very valid approach in potentially reducing the toxicity concerns associated with the drugs that are developed in PI3Ks and the mTOR class of inhibition as well. And the OM003 is a much earlier stage asset, which is probably 12 to 18 months away from a IND. And we are looking at developing that drug in glioblastoma as well as sarcoma. What I would also like to confirm with you is OM601 has received an orphan drug designation from the US FDA, and OM302 has an orphan drug designation from the US FDA for pediatric neuroblastoma, as well as it has a pediatric review designation, which makes us eligible potentially for a PRV, which I'm sure you're aware that's valued at an average of $110 million as well. So in a nutshell, that's what we have in our development. Very exciting times, some solid milestones expected in the next 12 to 18 months' time.
Well, it's a very exciting portfolio, but as a CEO running a bioscience company, how do you balance all of the resources that you need to, as well as the different stages of development that you're going through with each of your different therapeutics in the oncology space, some unrelated? How do you manage the balance in your portfolio as you're going through all of these clinical regulatory hurdles?
That's a great question. I have always been a firm believer that efficiency is key to a lot of decisions that are getting made as well. I ask a very simple question to a lot of our team members is, if we are going to allocate resources to this particular program, what's the major milestone that we are going to hit? And is that milestone good enough for us to make a go, no-go decision for this program? And if there is any doubts in our mind that the allocation of resources and allocation of capital does not lead us to the go, no-go decision, then you start looking at alternatives around what's the best strategy to take, right, in terms of portfolio review that you have. So we actually do that exercise every quarter and ask ourselves questions and be critical of ourselves when it needs to be, to really get to a stage where we say, should we just allocate resources with an expectation that we will do something after we hit this milestone? Or should we actually focus on generating value for our assets that are most needed, not only for the business, but also for the patients that we are developing the drugs for?
Yeah, I think one of the areas of validation for your portfolio is the ability to develop strategic partnerships with global partners, which you've done with Roche. And also, it gets extremely expensive as you're going through the clinical process. And it's nice to have partners to help fund that whole process as you progress to different stages clinically. So, yeah, congratulations on getting some of those partnerships established. Now, it all takes money, though, Vishal, and I'm talking to Vishal Doshi, who is the CEO of AUM Biosciences. Let's talk about what your financing strategy has been from the beginning with a company to take us to where we are today with what you're trying to do with your SPAC. And then we'll dive a little bit deeper into the SPAC individually, but I'm sure that you had to go through some interesting stages of funding to get to where you are today since 2018.
I'm still going through interesting stages of funding.
It never ends, Vishal.
I tell you, it's not chief executive officer, it's chief everything officer, as I say. No, I appreciate that question, Rich. And we started the company with a very small seed funding that predominantly came out of my own pockets and some founders and some angel investors that invested in the business. Again, very, very particular about efficiency and capital expenditure, right? So a dollar spent was questioned right from the beginning. It's just the mentality and the culture that we wanted to have. And believe it or not, Rich, I don't know if you agree with me on this, but it is the need of the hour in drug development, right? Good capital efficiency is the need of the hour for a lot of the biotech companies as well. We achieved quite a lot with the seed funding that we did. We actually built a portfolio with that seed funding. We've been very particular about not giving significant upfronts to our partners for one simple reason, that we would rather allocate the resources to the development of the programs rather than giving upfront monies to the people that we are licensing from. So that kind of helped us devise the deal structures accordingly. Secondly, we reached to a point where post building the portfolio, we did a Series A round of funding backed by Everlife Holdings, which is actually a subsidiary of Everstone Capital. Everstone Capital is a private equity fund with approximately 6 billion assets under management, predominantly based out of Singapore, New York, and in India. We did that $27 million Series A in 2021. Again, capital efficiency was very close to my heart on that, and resource allocation was very close to my heart. The other component that we worked on very closely was how can we leverage on non-dilutive capital as we develop the programs as well. And we actually got some significant non-dilutive capital raised over the last 3 to 4 years as well. And that helped us reach to certain milestones that we wanted to reach as well. So all in all, it was a combination of fundraising, non-dilutive funding, strategic partnerships, out-licensing that allowed us to reach to where we are right now. And I'm sure we are going to talk about our future fundraising strategies and the SPAC component, but this is what it has been right from the beginning. But as I said, here a lot of times on this particular podcast, you will hear the word capital efficiency. I am very, very particular about that. And I think that is something that I am not going to compromise. And I'm hoping I don't compromise on that over the coming years as well.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a very sound strategy, but sometimes you don't have total control of that strategy based on what market conditions are. And, you know, the whole bio industry over the last year is going through a little challenging time. And then, of course, what happened with Silicon Valley Bank last week has created some concerns, even though that's been resolved temporarily. How do you view what happened with SVB? Before we get into your SPAC, talk about the current market conditions in the financial world and maybe the implications SVB had on a lot of the entrepreneurial companies that they funded or involved in basically hosting all of their capital.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I mean, for me, the way I look at what happened with SVB has partly to do with how it was managed and partly to do with what the market conditions were, right? Clearly, a very reputed group of people, a very reputed group of bank that they were running as well. But I feel there's a lot to do with market conditions, with the interest rates going up, investors trying to find returns somewhere else. And then that kind of escalated the potential management issues associated with the venture debt aspect of it and the deposits component to it as well. So yeah, this could be a separate podcast for me, Rich. I have opinions on that, but my initial take on it is what I explained to you is it's partly to do with market conditions and partly to do with management as well. Talk about capital efficiency, huh?
Yeah, let's talk about your capital efficiency now and talking about your next future strategy for funding. And we know that you're going through a SPAC. For a lot of listeners who don't know what SPACs are, it's a special purpose acquisition corporation. It's an interesting funding vehicle, but it's been around for a while and had a lot of activity over the last 3 or 4 years. But talk a little bit about your SPAC strategy at AUM Biosciences, Vishal, and how you would looked at that as sort of the next stage of financing for the company.
Yeah, I mean, the underlying thought process of going for a SPAC is a question that we ask ourselves, or I would ask myself, is AUM Biosciences a company that is going to be a good IPO/public company? No matter whether we do it as an IPO or whether we do it as a SPAC, right? At the end of the day, we are going to become a public company. So once we go through SPAC, then there is no conversations that are going to be around SPAC, right? At the end of the day, it's going to be whether it's a good publicly run company or not, whether it has a good portfolio, whether it has good milestones, whether it has good data readouts coming through, whether it has good acquisition strategies that are coming through as well, whether it has good management that is running the business. So the first and the foremost component to even for the listeners about the SPAC component is whether the company is ready to go public or not, right? And I felt with 2 clinical stage programs and 2 preclinical stage programs, I think we were ready to get to a stage where we would be able to generate a lot of good milestones, which is what the market would like to hear as well. So that was just the first thought process around it. And then we feel very strongly that with a pre-money equity value of $400 million that was allocated as part of our SPAC deal that we did with Mountain Crest Acquisition Corp. 5, is a very reasonably priced company as compared to the comparables, which are trading quite high, even in these tough market environments as well. So we feel that we are going in with a valuation that a lot of investors have some scope to grow on, right? So that's definitely one part of it. The other things that really attracted us towards doing a SPAC and kind of address some of the concerns that I personally had around SPACs. One point that was very crucial for me is the SPAC that we signed up, and it's called Mountain Crest Acquisition Corp. 5, and we announced this deal in October last year, that this SPAC actually has no warrants built into it. Rich, you have been in this industry long enough to understand that very limited number of SPACs that you can name that have 0 warrants built into it, right? So that was one very crucial component. The other thing that I really felt very close to what we were looking at is the synergy between what the SPAC sponsor was looking for versus what AUM Biosciences brings on the table. It wasn't a conversation about fighting over small things, but it was more about how can we grow this company, right? How can Mountain Crest help grow this company called AUM Biosciences? And that is a very critical element when the SPAC sponsor has been very flexible right from the very beginning to help us focus on one goal, and only one goal is how do we grow this company into the next phase of the growth as well. So many components to this. When we signed this deal, we had approximately $69 million in trust. And even with some redemptions, you can expect some capital that comes along with it. We are actually raising PIPE financing as we speak. Again, it really depends on the market conditions and the terms and conditions that we're looking at. But all in all, there were too many pros is how I look at this versus cons when we worked with Mountain Crest Acquisition Corp in this as well. And to your point, Rich, sometimes you also have to factor in what the markets are going to look at as well, right? Sometimes you have to factor in market factors as well. And I feel that in 2022, it was kind of written on the wall that 2023 and 2024 are going to be 2 tough years for us to go through, right? And for any biotech to survive, you need good amount of capital. But even if you have a little bit capital that allows you to meet the right milestones, is where we are as a business, that we have capital to hit the right milestones in the coming months and coming years as well. And with our SPAC listing and potential fundraising coming up as well, it's just going to help us develop a growth plan rather than trying to think of surviving every single day.
Thank you for your history there on the SPAC, Vishal. And I guess the question I would ask is, if you had to go back and do it all over again, would you go through the same process that you have to bring you to where you are today, financing strategy wise?
Good question. I might make some changes to it, but firstly, I would only do things I'm very passionate about. And I think I've found my calling in founding biotech companies and in healthcare as well. So to answer your question in a very simplistic manner, yeah, I would make some changes, but I think this journey has taught me a lot, and I'm going to take a lot from this journey in the coming years as well.
Well, as the chief everything officer, you learn a lot through every stage that you go through with every company, I'm sure. So, but one of the other interesting aspects of your business based on your journey is that you are truly a global company with operations in multiple countries. talk about your global strategy and also some of the challenges associated with, I know you have operations in Singapore, Australia, China, and Bethesda, Maryland in America. Talk about just like balancing your portfolio. It's also balancing what you have in operations and your strategies globally. So talk a little bit about your global strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So the key message I want to give you on that is we have presence in Singapore, Australia, China, and Bethesda. Again, it is very resource efficient group of people. We have presence in all these countries, but we have a very lean structure from an organizational standpoint, right? So with Australia, we have presence in Australia with a chief operating officer and a few employees in Australia. Singapore being the hub that we set up this company with. US, because of multiple reasons, but I am very excited about the fact that we are moving to the journey with the SPAC as we are. And I've always been very clear and very excited about the fact that we would like to expand our presence in the US as well, right? With the portfolio that we have, do more studies, partner with somebody like an NIH with some exciting science that we have as well. So that's how I would like to think about this. We are looking at keeping a very lean structure. No matter we become a public company or not a public company, we are not going to be a company with 500,000, 2,000 people employees, 2,000 people company in the near future, at least not for now. But we are going to keep it very lean and focus on meeting the milestones for the business.
Yeah, organizationally, when you go into the different countries like you are, do you do that really as divisions of your company, or do you create wholly owned subsidiaries in each of these different countries?
Is the latter. These are all wholly owned subsidiaries of the parent co. And the idea around that was to create complementary expansion. And especially in biotech, when you are trying to do multiple trials globally, you don't want to create conflicts, but you want to create complementary relationships between the subsidiaries as well.
Yeah, and a lot of people probably don't know that sometimes when you have these wholly owned subsidiaries with their own governance and cap tables, it enables you to go after different forms of funding in some of these countries that you might not be able to go after as a parent company that's controlled out of Singapore.
Absolutely. You are spot on. That was one of the reasons that we also considered this wholly owned subsidiary strategy. And as I mentioned to you earlier, we are currently in discussions with a few non-dilutive funding companies, non-dilutive funding organizations, not only in the US, but in Australia and in China to help us with some of our science as well. So you're spot on that, Rich.
Yeah, and that's something we'll probably follow up after this podcast, because BioHealth Innovation, my organization, basically assists companies and some with international subsidiaries in the U.S. going after non-dilutive funding from the National Institute of Health, as they have numerous programs that you can collaborate with them, which you're probably aware of already. So we will follow up with you following this to see what we can do to assist you, since you have a Bethesda presence.
I would love to do that, Rich.
So let's talk a little bit now about your future, Vishal. And this is freelance. You basically have an open mic here. You can talk to the listeners about AUM Biosciences, where you are today, what your goals are for the future, and give a little insights to what your 3 to 5 year strategy is.
From where we are right now, I think this is a beginning of a very exciting phase of the company with some solid milestones that we plan to hit over the next 12 to 18 months. With the current portfolio we have, I think AUM Biosciences is a company that a lot of your listeners would believe it to be a group of individuals that know their science and know how to bring drugs from phase 1s to phase 2s and even try and get early accelerated approvals. So a 3 to 5 year strategy would look something like a much bigger portfolio with potential platform technologies coming under the wings of AUM Biosciences, which would also include some acquisitions in terms of molecules, in terms of technology, but create a more holistic mid-size pharma company that has a complementary relationships within the portfolio that we are developing, right? And then the idea is really to keep it focused on oncology for AUM Biosciences. And we will play with modalities and innovation that is going to help further to improve patients' lives as well. So I didn't want to go too deep into the strategy piece, but just to highlight some of the key components that we focus on as well.
Great. I'm sure it's going to be capital efficient in everything that you do, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So, yeah.
I say capital efficient every morning I wake up. And I say capital efficient every time I go to sleep instead of saying good morning and good night.
That is your credo. Well, it really isn't a bad one to have in this time that we have right now within this industry and within the economy globally. So I'm sure your investors will appreciate that. I want to thank you for being on BioTech Podcast. Vishal Doshi, who's the CEO and founder of AUM Biosciences, and global company that has operations in Singapore, Australia, China, and America, and the Bethesda, Maryland area. And we'd look to follow up with you on some things that we can do to help your company grow. But more importantly, like to follow up with you on another podcast down in the future to continue to check on the progress of AUM and how you're meeting your milestones.
Absolutely. Rich, once again, thank you very much for this exciting conversation. And to all your listeners, have a beautiful day and have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.